My wife kicked me out and filed for divorce after winning $10 million in the lottery, but she forgot about the prenup. I used to think my life was simple, good, even. I worked a steady job at a sporting goods store, had a cozy apartment, and a wife I adored. Lauren was everything I wasn't: polished, confident, raised in a world of country clubs and private schools. But love, I thought, could bridge any gap. Turns out love isn't always enough. Lauren's parents, Richard and Victoria, made it clear from day one that I wasn't good enough for their daughter. Richard, a real estate mogul with a taste for expensive whiskey and expensive opinions, barely acknowledged me. Victoria was all passive-aggressive smiles, constantly reminding Lauren how she could have married someone more suited to her background. Then came the prenup. Richard presented it with the same casualness as a dinner menu, like it was just another box to check. Lauren brushed it off, told me it was a formality, that we'd never need it. I didn't love the idea, but I trusted her. Biggest mistake of my life. The wedding was a spectacle. White roses, crystal chandeliers. A venue that probably cost more than my entire salary for a decade. My parents, Thomas and Margaret, sat in the corner, out of place among the silk ties and designer dresses. They smiled, though. They always smiled, even when they knew something wasn't right. At first, marriage wasn't bad. I ignored the little things. The way Lauren's parents constantly helped us, always with strings attached. They bought us a condo in a high-rise downtown. But it wasn't a gift. It was a leash. Richard still owned it, still made the rules. I'd come home and find Victoria rearranging furniture, Richard calling the shots on renovations like it was his place, not ours. Lauren changed too. Slowly. She started talking like them, thinking like them. Money became the center of every conversation. She'd sigh when I mentioned my job, hint that I should strive for more. But I liked my job. I liked simple things. Barbecues on Sundays, shooting hoops with friends, grabbing a cold beer after work. That wasn't enough for her. I tried to hold on, to be patient, told myself she was just adjusting, that things would settle. But every dinner with her family felt like a test I was failing. Richard and Victoria would exchange glances, talk about their latest investments, their luxury vacations, while I sat there nodding, feeling like an outsider in my own marriage. Lauren became distant. She'd spend more nights out, always networking or attending charity events. I wanted to believe her, but deep down I felt it. That slow, creeping sensation that something was slipping through my fingers. I was stocking shelves at work when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Lauren's name flashed on the screen. Before I could even say hello, she was screaming. At first, I thought something terrible had happened, but then I caught the words that changed everything. $10 million. She had won the damn lottery. My mind raced. $10 million. No more working at the store. No more Richard and Victoria treating me like trash. We could finally buy a house, one without Lauren's parents pulling the strings. Maybe even move somewhere far away. Start fresh. For the first time in years, I felt like we had a future that was ours, not dictated by her family. But that feeling didn't last long. Lauren started acting different almost immediately. She was suddenly too busy for our usual routines. Long meetings, endless phone calls. I asked who she was talking to, but she waved it off, saying she needed financial advice. Made sense, right? Except the people advising her weren't anyone I had ever heard of. Then she stopped mentioning the money altogether. I brought it up once, joking about quitting my job, and she shut it down fast. Said I didn't need to worry about it. That's when the pit started forming in my stomach. One night, I was in the bedroom, getting ready for bed, when I overheard her talking on the phone in the next room. Her voice was hushed, but I caught enough. She was talking about legal papers, about making sure everything was ironclad, about protecting what was hers. It hit me like a freight train. She was planning to leave me. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to confront her, demand answers, but I needed to be sure. So I waited, listened, tried to piece it together. The next day, she acted normal, too normal, like she was rehearsing a part. Then, 2 days later, I came home from work to find boxes stacked in the living room. My clothes, my books, my things, packed up like I was a guest who overstayed his welcome. Lauren stood there with her aunt, both of them eerily calm. She didn't even look upset. She told me she was filing for divorce. Just like that. Like she was ordering takeout. I argued. I yelled. None of it mattered. She had already made up her mind. She told me to leave immediately. When I pushed back, she dropped the final bomb. This was her apartment, not ours. Her father had made the down payment, which meant I had no claim to it. Legally, she was right. I was losing everything in real time. Desperate, I stepped outside and called my dad. My voice shook as I explained what was happening. There was a pause. Then his voice came through, steady, solid. Don't rush. Get a lawyer. This isn't over. I hung up, staring at the place I had called home. My life was crumbling, but something told me this fight was just beginning. I packed what little dignity I had left and moved back into my parents' house. It wasn't how I pictured my 30s, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, staring at posters of basketball players I hadn't thought about in a decade. My dad, Thomas, didn't say much that first night. He just handed me a beer, sat beside me on the porch, and let me process everything in silence. The next morning he made a call. By noon, I was sitting across from Jason, my dad's old friend and one hell of a lawyer. He was older now, gray at the temples but still sharp as ever. He flipped through my prenup, skimming it like he'd seen 1,000 just like it. Then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. That was not the reaction I was expecting. Jason slid the document back across the table, tapping one particular clause with his finger. Turns out, Richard and Victoria, in their arrogance, had overlooked something big. The contract stated that any financial gains during the marriage, including lottery winnings, were considered marital assets. In other words, half of that $10 million belonged to me. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger. I felt hope. Lauren and her parents realized their mistake almost as quickly as we did. Within days, Victoria reached out, trying to settle things amicably. She invited me to lunch, all smiles and fake concern, pretending she suddenly cared about my well-being. When she finally got to the point, she offered me a fraction of what I was owed, acting like she was doing me a favor. I declined, politely at first. The next move came from Richard. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He sent a message loud and clear. If I didn't take the deal, I'd be ruined. He had connections. He could get me fired, blacklist me from any decent job. I was nothing, and he would make sure I stayed that way. I should have been scared. Maybe I was. But something inside me had snapped. I wasn't that quiet, patient guy anymore. I wasn't about to roll over and let them take everything from me. With Jason's help, I filed a motion to freeze the lottery funds. No secret transfers, no disappearing money. If they wanted to play dirty, they'd have to do it in court. Lauren's lawyers retaliated instantly, throwing every legal trick in the book at me. Suddenly, I was a villain. They painted me as a bitter, greedy ex trying to steal what wasn't mine. The media got wind of it. My name started popping up in articles, twisted to fit whatever narrative benefited Lauren's family. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was war. And I was just getting started. The courtroom was packed. Lauren sat across from me, her expression unreadable, flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys. She looked every bit the polished, privileged woman I once loved. But love didn't matter anymore. Her lead lawyer, a smug guy in an overpriced suit, started strong. He painted me as a bitter, vindictive ex trying to cash in on money that wasn't mine. He argued that the lottery ticket was hers alone, purchased with her personal funds. That's when Jason stood up. without a word. He handed a stack of papers to the judge. The room went silent as the judge flipped through them. Then Jason spoke, calm, deliberate. The ticket wasn't purchased with Lauren's personal funds. It was bought using our joint account. Lauren shifted in her seat. Her lawyers scrambled, whispering among themselves. Richard, sitting behind them, turned red with rage. He leaned forward, clearly wanting to object, but there was nothing he could do. The judge wasted no time. Effective immediately, all assets were frozen until a final ruling. No secret transfers, no last-minute financial tricks. Richard stormed out of the courtroom, slamming the door behind him. Victoria, ever the diplomat, waited until recess to approach me. She tried to play it soft, told me this was all a misunderstanding, that a lengthy court battle wasn't good for anyone. She hinted at a private settlement, a reasonable payout if I just let things go. I almost laughed. Months ago, I might have considered it, but I wasn't that man anymore. I told her to take the deal to someone who cared. Lauren finally looked shaken. For the first time, she seemed unsure, vulnerable. She pulled me aside, told me this wasn't her doing, that her parents had forced her into this fight. Maybe once I would have believed her. Maybe a part of me still wanted to, but it didn't matter. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. As I left the courtroom, I realized something. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about standing my ground, about proving that they couldn't walk all over me. And from the way Richard and his lawyers were scrambling, I knew this was far from over. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Lauren sat across from me, barely looking up. Richard and Victoria, usually so composed, were visibly tense. Jason sat beside me, calm as ever, but I could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on both of us. The judge cleared his throat and began reading the verdict. My heart pounded as I waited for the words that would determine everything. Then they came. The lottery winnings were marital assets. I was entitled to a significant share. Richard let out an audible scoff, shaking his head in disbelief. Victoria clasped her hands in her lap, her nails digging into her skin. Lauren, she just sat there, staring at the table, her face drained of any emotion. But it wasn't over. The judge continued. Since I had contributed to the apartment for years, Lauren was required to compensate me for my share. No more being pushed out with nothing. I exhaled, the tightness in my chest loosening for the first time in weeks. I glanced over at Jason, who gave me a small nod. We had won. Lauren didn't argue, didn't fight. She just accepted it. Maybe she knew there was no way out, or maybe she had finally realized that her parents had led her into this disaster. Either way, she sat motionless as the judge finalized the divorce. The gavel hit the desk, and just like that, it was done. I stood up, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. No more walking on eggshells. No more feeling like I was drowning in someone else's life. I walked out of that courtroom a free man, and damn, it felt good. Richard stormed out, barking something at his lawyers. Victoria followed, her face still a mask of forced grace. Lauren remained behind, still seated, still staring at the table. I should have felt bad for her. Maybe I did, in some small way. But mostly, I felt relief. Outside, the sun was shining, and for the first time in a long time, I could actually breathe. The check arrived a week after the final ruling. Holding it in my hands felt surreal. After everything, I finally had the means to start over, no strings attached. First, I took care of my parents. They had stood by me when I had nothing, so I paid off their mortgage and set them up with enough savings to enjoy retirement without stress. Seeing the relief on their faces made it all worth it. Then I focused on myself. I bought a house, not a mansion, not some ridiculous luxury estate, just a solid home where no one could tell me what to do or where to go. It felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in years. No reminders of Lauren, no meddling in-laws, just peace. I didn't just sit around, though. I found a job that I actually cared about, something on my own terms, not what others expected of me. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about control over my own life. Meanwhile, Lauren's name became a joke in her social circles. Word spread fast. Everyone learned how she and her family had tried to cut me out, how they had lost spectacularly. The same people who used to idolize her now whispered behind her back. The irony was almost poetic. The prenup that was supposed to protect her family had ended up being their biggest mistake. I never heard from Lauren again. Not a text, not a call. Her family disappeared from my world completely. Maybe they moved. Maybe they just didn't want to face the embarrassment. Either way, they were gone, and I was fine with that. More than fine. I walked away from that mess with more than just money. I walked away with knowledge. I knew now how the world worked. I wasn't some naive guy anymore who thought love alone was enough. I had learned how to protect myself, how to see people for who they really were. Justice isn't always guaranteed, but sometimes, just sometimes, it finds its way. And when it does, you take it and you never look back.
Bye-bye.